The oldest written prescription for ginger was found on a Sumerian clay tablet dating to around 2000 BC. The Sumerians were prescribing ginger for stomach conditions before the Egyptian pyramids were fully built. Before the ancient Greeks had developed their medical tradition, before most of recorded history had begun. And what the Sumerians prescribed it for is the same thing your grandmother told you to drink ginger tea for when you had a stomachache. Some knowledge is so accurate it survives 4,000 years without needing to be updated. But that Sumerian tablet is only the oldest written record. The actual medical use of ginger predates it by centuries. Ancient Indian Ayurvedic physicians had been prescribing ginger for at least 1,000 years before the Sumerians carved it into clay. Ancient Chinese physicians had been documenting it for generations before that. The written record begins in Sumer. The medical history begins much earlier and goes much deeper. Here is what makes ginger different from every other herb we have covered in this series. Rosemary was documented by multiple civilizations. Garlic achieved independent convergence across 6 traditions. Turmeric reached from India to Egypt to Rome. Frankincense connected surgery and spirituality across 5,000 years. But ginger achieved something none of them did. Every major medical tradition in human history independently decided they could not practice medicine without it. Every single one. Ancient India, ancient China, ancient Egypt, ancient Sumer, ancient Greece, Rome, the Islamic Golden Age. Every tradition that ever seriously studied the human body and how to heal it arrived at ginger and stayed there. This is not a herb with a good reputation. This is the most universally agreed upon medicine in human history, and it is sitting in your refrigerator right now being used to flavor things. This is the full story of ginger, where the medical history actually begins, what ancient healers across every tradition actually used it for, why every civilization that encountered it decided it was essential rather than merely useful, and what modern science has confirmed about a root that has been the foundation of more medical traditions than any other plant on earth. The first thing you need to understand about ginger is that the version of it you know is the smallest and least interesting version of what it actually is. Today we know ginger as a flavor, a cooking ingredient, something that goes in stir-fry and ginger beer and Christmas biscuits, something your mother gives you when you feel sick because ginger is good for nausea, something you might see in a wellness supplement alongside turmeric and black pepper, marketed as an anti-inflammatory blend. None of these versions of ginger are wrong. They are just incomplete. They describe the shadow of the thing rather than the thing itself. Ginger's botanical name is Zingiber officinale. It is a flowering plant whose underground rhizome, the same knobbly root you buy at the grocery store, has been one of the most important medicinal substances on Earth for at least 5,000 years. It is native to Southeast Asia, but has been so extensively cultivated for so long across so many parts of the world that its precise origin is difficult to establish. What is not difficult to establish is its medical history. That history is the most extensively documented of any plant in the ancient herbal record. In ancient Sanskrit, ginger was called Vishwabhesaj. It means the universal medicine, not one medicine among many, the universal medicine, the medicine that applies to everything and everyone. The Ayurvedic physicians who gave it that name were not being hyperbolic. They were describing a clinical reality that generations of careful observation had confirmed. Ginger works across more body systems, for more conditions, in more patient types, across more seasons and climates than almost any other single medicinal plant ever studied. Ancient Chinese physicians called it jiang and distinguished carefully between fresh ginger, which they called shengjiang, and dried ginger, which they called ganjiang. They considered these almost as 2 different medicines with different applications and different strengths. That level of pharmacological precision about a single plant is not something you develop about a cooking ingredient. That is something you develop about a medicine you have been working with for a very long time. When you understand that, the grandmother with the ginger tea stops seeming like folk wisdom and starts seeming like the last surviving fragment of a 5,000-year medical tradition. She was right. She was right, because everyone who ever looked carefully at this plant arrived at the same conclusions about it, and now modern science is explaining why. The deepest and most extensive documentation of ginger as medicine exists in the Ayurvedic tradition of ancient India. And the depth of that documentation is extraordinary, even by the remarkable standards of ancient Indian medical scholarship. Ginger appears in the earliest Ayurvedic medical texts. The Karaka Samhita, the foundational text of Ayurvedic internal medicine, mentions ginger in over 100 separate formulations. Not 100 conditions, 100 formulations. Specific prepared combinations of ginger with other medicinal substances for specific therapeutic applications. This represents a level of pharmaceutical development around a single plant that has no parallel in the ancient herbal record. The Charaka Samhita classifies ginger as both a dipaniya, meaning a digestive fire stimulant, and a pachana, meaning a digestive aid. In Ayurvedic medicine, these are not the same thing, and the distinction matters. A dipaniya strengthens the underlying digestive capacity. A pachana helps digest what is already there. Ginger does both. Ancient Indian physicians had identified through clinical observation that ginger addresses digestive problems at both the functional and the acute level simultaneously. The Sushruta Samhita, the surgical text, prescribes ginger as a pre-operative preparation given to patients before surgery to strengthen digestion and reduce what Sushruta described as the toxic accumulation that builds in the body before a major procedure. This maps onto what modern research identifies as ginger's ability to reduce systemic inflammation and support immune function. Ancient surgical preparation using ginger was pharmacologically justified. But perhaps the most revealing thing about how deeply Ayurvedic medicine understood ginger is the name Vishwabhesaj itself. Universal medicine. This is not a title given lightly in a medical tradition that documented hundreds of medicinal plants with extraordinary precision. It was given to ginger specifically because Ayurvedic physicians had observed over centuries that ginger produced consistent therapeutic benefit across virtually every category of patient and virtually every category of condition. The elderly, the young, the strong, the weak, the hot constitution and the cold constitution. In every season and every climate, ginger worked. Not for everything, but for enough that the physicians who knew it best decided it deserved a name that no other plant received. Ayurvedic medicine prescribed ginger for digestive disorders of every kind, from acute nausea to chronic indigestion to intestinal parasites. It was prescribed for respiratory conditions, for joint pain and inflammatory conditions, for fever, for what Ayurvedic texts describe as conditions of excess cold and dampness in the body, for headaches, for heart conditions, and as a general warming tonic for those whose constitution ran cold. The breadth of application is not because ginger cures everything. It is because ginger has genuine therapeutic mechanisms that address the underlying physiology of a remarkably broad range of conditions. Modern pharmacology is now identifying those mechanisms one by one. The Chinese medical tradition's engagement with ginger is, if anything, even more remarkable than the Indian traditions. And it includes one of the most compelling personal details in the entire history of ancient medicine. Confucius, the Chinese philosopher and statesman whose teachings shaped Chinese civilization for 2,500 years, ate ginger with every single meal. He wrote about this practice specifically, noting that he never ate a meal without ginger. Not because he was a food enthusiast, because his medical advisors had prescribed daily ginger consumption as a health practice. Confucius lived to approximately 72 years old, which in the 5th century BC was an extraordinary age. His daily ginger practice had been recommended by physicians working within a tradition that had been studying ginger's medical applications for centuries before he was born. Ginger appears in the Shenong Benkao Jing, the Divine Farmer's Classic of Herbal Medicine, which is the foundational text of Chinese herbal medicine. It is documented as a warming herb that enters the lung, stomach, and spleen meridians, and is prescribed for cold and damp conditions, for nausea and vomiting, for coughs and respiratory conditions, for what Chinese medicine describes as dispersing wind cold from the body, and for strengthening the body's yang energy. But the scale of Chinese medical ginger documentation goes far beyond the foundational text. Traditional Chinese medicine has documented ginger for over 400 separate clinical applications across 2,500 years of practice. Over 400. No other single plant in the entire Chinese herbal pharmacopoeia has this breadth of documented clinical application. Chinese physicians distinguished carefully between fresh and dried ginger, not as a culinary preference, but as a medical distinction. Fresh ginger, shengjiang, was prescribed for acute conditions, for dispersing external cold and relieving nausea and vomiting. Dried ginger, ganjiang, was prescribed for chronic conditions, for warming the interior of the body and addressing deeper cold conditions affecting the digestive and respiratory systems. Two preparations of the same plant, with distinct clinical applications documented with pharmaceutical precision. Li Shizhen, the great 16th-century Chinese physician whose Bencao Gangmu is the most comprehensive Chinese herbal compendium ever compiled, devoted extensive attention to ginger. He documented it across multiple sections of his work, treating fresh and dried ginger as distinct medicines. He noted its specific effectiveness for conditions of cold and dampness, for digestive weakness, for respiratory conditions involving excessive mucus, for nausea of all kinds including morning sickness, and as a general warming and strengthening tonic for conditions of deficiency. The 400 documented applications of ginger in Chinese medicine are not 400 different conditions. They are 400 specific formulations, dosages, preparation methods, and clinical contexts in which ginger has been documented as therapeutically effective across 2,500 years of systematic clinical observation. That is the most comprehensive single-plant clinical database in the history of ancient medicine. The Sumerian clay tablet that opens this story is significant, not just as the oldest written ginger prescription, but as evidence of how widely ginger had traveled by the time writing systems existed to record it. Sumer was in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Ginger is native to Southeast Asia. For ginger to appear in Sumerian medical records around 2000 BC, it had already traveled thousands of miles along ancient trade routes, been evaluated by Sumerian physicians, found effective for digestive conditions, and been incorporated into their medical practice with enough consistency to warrant being carved into permanent records. All of that happened before anyone wrote it down. The clay tablet is not the beginning of the story. It is evidence of a story that had already been developing for a very long time. Egyptian medical papyri document ginger for digestive conditions, for respiratory complaints, and in preparations for what Egyptian physicians described as warming the body and stimulating its natural energy. The Ebers Papyrus, the great Egyptian medical compendium, includes ginger in multiple preparations. Egyptian physicians understood ginger as a warming and stimulating medicine that addressed conditions of cold and stagnation in the body, a clinical classification that maps precisely onto both the Indian and Chinese medical frameworks, despite being developed independently. Ancient Egyptian physicians also used ginger extensively in preparations for the digestive system, because digestive disease was one of the primary health challenges faced by a civilization built on the banks of a river. Contaminated water, intestinal parasites, and foodborne illness were constant threats. Ginger's documented effectiveness against nausea, against digestive cramping, and potentially against certain bacterial and parasitic conditions made it a clinical essential in Egyptian medicine. The Arab medical tradition, which developed into the Islamic Golden Age, had access to ginger through extensive trade networks that connected the Arabian Peninsula to India and Southeast Asia. Arab physicians were among the world's most sophisticated pharmacological thinkers, and they were specifically interested in ginger because of the detailed documentation that existed in both the Indian and the emerging Chinese medical traditions. Arab traders who facilitated the spice trade between Asia and the Mediterranean world were also carrying medical knowledge in both directions, and ginger's reputation as a medical essential preceded it wherever it traveled. When ginger reached the Greek and Roman world, through Arab and Persian trade networks, it encountered a medical culture that was predisposed to evaluate it carefully and document its effects systematically. Dioscorides in De Materia Medica documented ginger for digestive complaints and specifically noted its effectiveness for warming the stomach and aiding digestion. He also documented it for its ability to neutralize what he described as poisons, which in the context of ancient medicine referred to toxic conditions in the body, including food poisoning, a use that maps onto ginger's modern documented antimicrobial properties. Galen, whose medical influence extended well into the Renaissance, prescribed ginger as a warming medicine in the framework of Greek humoral theory. He classified it as warming and moderately drying, prescribed it for digestive weakness, for respiratory complaints involving excess phlegm, and as a general tonic for those whose constitution ran cold and damp. Galen's classification of ginger in the Greek humoral framework maps with remarkable precision onto the Indian Ayurvedic classification of ginger as a medicine for cold and damp conditions and the Chinese classification of ginger, warming herb that addresses cold and damp conditions in the body. Three completely independent medical frameworks arriving at the same clinical classification of the same plant. Pliny the Elder in his Natural History documented ginger and noted its digestive properties and its use in warming preparations. Roman soldiers were given ginger as part of their field rations, not as a flavoring but as a digestive medicine and general tonic that helped them maintain health on long campaigns in cold and wet conditions. The same cold and damp conditions that every ancient medical tradition identified as ginger's primary therapeutic territory. Ibn Sina in the Canon of Medicine devoted significant attention to ginger. He classified it as a warming medicine of the second degree, meaning moderately warm, and prescribed it for digestive disorders, for respiratory conditions, for joint pain, for conditions affecting the liver, and as an aphrodisiac and general tonic. He specifically noted its effectiveness for paralysis and for conditions he described as involving weakness of the nerves, which maps onto what modern research identifies as ginger's anti-inflammatory effects on neural tissue. Ibn Sina also documented ginger for toothache, applied directly to the affected area, a topical antimicrobial application that modern research on ginger's antibacterial properties confirms was pharmacologically justified. Al-Razi documented ginger extensively for digestive conditions and as a warming tonic. He noted its specific effectiveness for conditions involving excessive cold and mucus in the respiratory system, mapping precisely onto the Chinese classification of ginger for cold and damp conditions affecting the lungs. If this is showing you ginger in a way you have never seen it before, take a second right now and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you have not already. Leave a comment, even just one word. That is genuinely how more people find this content, and it means more than you know. Thank you for being here. Now, let us get into the science. The key to understanding why ginger works across such a remarkable range of conditions is a family of active compounds found in the ginger rhizome. The most important of these are gingerols, which are the primary active compounds in fresh ginger, and shogols, which are the primary active compounds in dried ginger. This distinction matters, and it is exactly the distinction that ancient Chinese physicians made when they documented fresh and dried ginger as two different medicines with different clinical applications. They were right. They are pharmacologically different. Gingerols are the compounds responsible for fresh ginger's sharp, pungent flavor. They are powerful anti-inflammatory agents, potent antioxidants, and they have demonstrated significant antimicrobial, anti-nausea, and analgesic properties. Shogols form when ginger is dried or cooked, as gingerols lose water molecules and become shogols. Shogols are generally more potent than gingerols in terms of anti-inflammatory and anti-nausea activity, which explains why ancient Chinese physicians observed that dried ginger was more effective for deeper chronic conditions. They were observing the pharmacological difference between gingerols and shogols through clinical outcomes without having any concept of either compound. Start with the nausea and digestive research. This is the area with the strongest and most conclusive clinical evidence for ginger. A 2005 review published in the journal Obstetrics and Gynecology found ginger significantly more effective than placebo for nausea and vomiting of pregnancy. This is important because nausea of pregnancy is notoriously difficult to treat safely, and ginger represents one of the few interventions with a strong safety profile alongside clinical efficacy. Ancient physicians across every tradition documented ginger specifically for nausea in pregnant women. They were documenting something with confirmed clinical evidence. A 2012 systematic review published in the British Journal of Anesthesia found that ginger significantly reduced postoperative nausea compared to placebo. A meta-analysis published in Supportive Care in Cancer found that ginger supplementation significantly reduced chemotherapy-induced nausea. The Sumerian clay tablet, prescribing ginger for stomach conditions 4,000 years ago, was describing the same clinical application that modern oncology is now using to help cancer patients tolerate chemotherapy. The knowledge survived 4,000 years because it works. The mechanism behind ginger's anti-nausea effects has been identified as 5-HT3 receptor antagonism. Ginger compounds block the same serotonin receptors in the gut and brain that are blocked by some of the most widely used antiemetic pharmaceutical drugs. Ancient physicians who prescribed ginger for nausea were using a natural 5-HT3 antagonist centuries before pharmaceutical companies developed synthetic versions of the same mechanism. Move to the anti-inflammatory research. Gingerols and shogols inhibit multiple inflammatory pathways simultaneously. They inhibit cyclooxygenase enzymes, the same enzymes targeted by ibuprofen and aspirin. They inhibit 5-lipoxygenase, the same enzyme inhibited by frankincense, boswellic acids. They inhibit NF-κB, the master inflammatory regulator inhibited by curcumin and AKBA. One plant. 3 simultaneous anti-inflammatory mechanisms that modern pharmaceutical companies have developed separate drugs to target individually. A 2015 meta-analysis published in Osteoarthritis and Cartilage found that ginger supplementation significantly reduced pain and disability in patients with osteoarthritis of the knee. The ancient prescriptions for joint pain were pharmacologically accurate. Move to the antimicrobial research. Multiple studies have documented significant antibacterial activity from ginger compounds against a range of pathogenic bacteria, including strains that cause food poisoning, respiratory infections, and urinary tract infections. A study published in the Journal of Microbiology and Biotechnology found that fresh ginger showed significant antibacterial activity against multiple pathogenic bacteria. The ancient prescriptions for ginger in conditions involving infection, or what ancient texts describe as toxins in the body, were describing real antibacterial activity. Move to the cardiovascular research. Ginger compounds have been shown to reduce blood clotting by inhibiting platelet aggregation, to reduce blood pressure through vasodilatory effects, and to reduce LDL cholesterol. A 2019 meta-analysis published in the journal Phytomedicine found that ginger supplementation significantly reduced triglycerides and LDL cholesterol compared to placebo. Ancient Indian Ayurvedic physicians who prescribed ginger for heart conditions were identifying real cardiovascular mechanisms. Move to the cancer research. This area requires the same careful handling as with every herb we have discussed. Clinical cancer treatment claims cannot be made, but ginger compounds have shown activity against multiple cancer cell lines in laboratory studies. The primary mechanism appears to involve 6-shogol, one of the most potent shogol compounds, which has demonstrated selective activity against cancer stem cells, the cells most responsible for cancer recurrence and treatment resistance. A 2015 study published in PLOS One found that 6-shogol was more effective against breast cancer stem cells than the standard chemotherapy drug Taxol in laboratory conditions. This is preliminary research, but it is significant. Move to the brain and neurological research. Ancient physicians across multiple traditions documented ginger for conditions affecting the brain and nervous system. Modern research has identified neuroprotective effects from ginger compounds through multiple mechanisms. Ginger reduces neuroinflammation, which is increasingly recognized as a driver of neurodegenerative conditions, including Alzheimer's disease. A 2011 study in the journal Evidence-Based Complementary and Alternative Medicine found that ginger extract improved working memory and cognitive function in middle-aged women compared to placebo. The ancient prescriptions for ginger as a brain tonic had a real neurobiological basis. The breadth of confirmed pharmacological activity in ginger: anti-nausea through 5-HT3 antagonism, anti-inflammatory through 3 simultaneous pathways, antimicrobial, cardiovascular protective, potentially anti-cancer, and neuroprotective, explains exactly why ancient healers from every tradition on earth independently arrived at the conclusion that they could not practice medicine without it. They were observing real pharmacological mechanisms through clinical outcomes without having any way to understand the biochemistry. Modern science is providing the biochemistry, and every mechanism confirms the ancient observation. Knowing that ginger works is one thing. Understanding how ancient healers actually prepared and used it is another. And as with every herb in this series, the ancient methods were considerably more sophisticated than slicing ginger into hot water and calling it tea. Ancient healers worked with ginger in 5 primary ways. The first was fresh ginger juice. Raw fresh ginger root, grated or crushed, and the juice extracted immediately for use. This preparation delivers the highest concentration of gingerols and was the method preferred by Ayurvedic and Chinese physicians for acute conditions, particularly for acute nausea, vomiting, and digestive cramping. Ancient Indian physicians prescribed fresh ginger juice mixed with honey and lime for acute digestive emergencies. The speed of action from fresh ginger juice for nausea is well documented in modern research. The ancient preference for fresh juice over other preparations for acute conditions was pharmacologically correct. The second was dried ginger powder. Ginger root dried and ground into a fine powder was considered by Chinese and Ayurvedic physicians to be a different and in many ways more potent medicine than fresh ginger. As we have discussed, the drying process converts gingerols into shogals, which have greater anti-inflammatory potency. Ancient physicians who prescribed dried ginger specifically for chronic inflammatory conditions, for deep cold conditions, and for long-term tonification were prescribing a pharmacologically distinct preparation with greater potency for those specific applications. The third was ginger decoction. Fresh or dried ginger simmered in water for an extended period, far longer than a simple tea, to extract the maximum concentration of active compounds into the liquid. Chinese physicians were particularly specific about decoction times and temperatures for ginger preparations. Li Shizhen documented specific decoction methods for different ginger preparations and different clinical applications. Ginger decoction was prescribed for respiratory conditions, for joint pain, for fever, and for digestive weakness. The extended simmering extracts compounds that a brief steeping does not reach and produces a clinically distinct preparation from ginger tea. The fourth was ginger in oil or ghee preparations. Ayurvedic physicians developed ginger preparations in medicated oils and clarified butter, using the same Tila and Grita preparation methods used for turmeric and frankincense. Ginger medicated oil was used both internally and externally. Applied externally to painful joints, to the chest for respiratory conditions, and to the abdomen for digestive conditions, ginger oil delivers gingerols and shogals transdermally to the affected tissue. Taken internally, the fat base increases bioavailability of the active compounds in exactly the same way that fat increases curcumin and boswellic acid bioavailability. Ancient Ayurvedic physicians had observed this clinically and built it into their most sophisticated preparations. The fifth was ginger combined with other medicinal plants. Of all the herbs we have covered in this series, ginger is the one most consistently documented across ancient traditions as a combination medicine rather than a solo medicine. Ancient Ayurvedic trikatu, meaning 3 pungents, is one of the most important formulations in all of Ayurvedic medicine. It combines dried ginger, black pepper, and long pepper in specific ratios. This combination was prescribed as a foundational digestive and anti-inflammatory formula taken daily as a health maintenance practice. The combination is pharmacologically sophisticated. Black pepper's piperine increases the bioavailability of ginger's active compounds, in the same way it increases curcumin's bioavailability. Long pepper adds its own active compounds. The three together produce effects that none of them produces alone at the same dosage. Ancient Ayurvedic physicians formalized a synergistic pharmacological combination 3,000 years before pharmacology existed as a discipline. Ginger was also consistently combined with honey across multiple traditions. Egyptian, Indian, Chinese, and Islamic physicians all documented ginger and honey combinations for respiratory conditions, for coughs, and for digestive complaints. Honey adds its own antimicrobial properties and improves palatability. The ancient combination is not coincidence. It is accumulated clinical wisdom about synergistic preparation. So what do we do with all of this? Ginger is not a miracle cure. The ancient healers who called it the universal medicine were not claiming it cures everything. They were describing a plant with genuine therapeutic mechanisms across a wider range of conditions than almost any other medicinal substance they had encountered. And that description has been confirmed by modern science, with more clinical evidence than exists for most pharmaceutical drugs currently on the market. Here are the three things that stay with me most from this story. The first is the universality. We have covered 5 herbs in this series, and every one of them achieved remarkable cross-civilization convergence. But ginger achieved something different. Every other herb had traditions that did not document it, cultures that encountered it and moved on, medical systems that found it useful but not essential. Ginger has none of those gaps. Every major medical tradition in human history, every single one, India, China, Egypt, Sumer, Greece, Rome, the Islamic world, all of them arrived at ginger independently. All of them decided it was essential rather than useful. All of them kept it at the center of their medical practice for as long as their traditions survived. That is not convergence. That is unanimous agreement. And unanimity across 5,000 years of independent medical observation by the most sophisticated healers in human history is the strongest possible form of evidence that something real is happening in this plant. The second is the grandmother detail. When your grandmother gave you ginger tea for a stomachache, she was not doing folk medicine. She was transmitting the last surviving fragment of a medical tradition that stretches back to a Sumerian clay tablet from 2000 BC. She did not know that. But the knowledge was accurate when the Sumerians carved it into clay. It was accurate when Confucius's physician prescribed it 2,500 years ago. It was accurate when Ayurvedic physicians called it Vishwabhesaj 4,000 years ago. And it is confirmed as accurate by modern 5-HT3 receptor antagonism research today. Your grandmother was right. She was right because she was connected through an unbroken chain of human transmission to 4,000 years of accumulated clinical wisdom about one of the most pharmacologically verified plants on earth. The third is the simplest. Ginger is available. Fresh ginger root is in every grocery store on earth. Dried ginger powder is in every kitchen. The ancient preparations, fresh ginger juice for acute nausea, dried ginger in warm preparations for chronic inflammatory conditions, ginger with black pepper for digestive strength, ginger with honey for respiratory conditions. These are not complicated. They do not require a prescription or a specialist. They require only the knowledge of what you are actually holding and an understanding of how to use it the way the people who knew it best actually used it. Confucius ate ginger every day. The father of surgery prescribed it before operations. The Sumerians carved its prescription into permanent stone. Ibn Sina devoted pages of the most influential medical text of the medieval world to it. And every grandmother in every culture that ever encountered this plant passed down the knowledge of its most important application to the next generation without being told why it worked. Now you know why it works. And knowing that, you can decide what to do with it. If this opens something up for you, the best thing you can do is subscribe, leave a comment, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. That is genuinely how more people find this content. Please keep us in your prayers. God bless you.